Yes, I do work on birds, so I'm not really going to get to talk about them very much today. I'm going to talk about the darker side of what I do, which is dealing with environmental policy, particularly in the environmental impact assessment and offset space. And the talk that I'm about to give is probably going to bear some relationship, but not much, to this title. So I might move to the next slide, which is where I intended to kick it off, if we can get a transition. Who's heard of Nature Positive? How many people in the audience? Yeah, only, really? I thought maybe more. That was about 60% of people. Interesting. So it's actually a relatively new term. Does anybody know what it means? Correct. Nobody. It's another one of these buzzwords, I guess we could say unkindly, that's floating around out there, and there are organisations everywhere attempting to define it, coming up with alternative definitions right now. I think my next it's not a good idea that I had several animations in this presentation, apologies, but if we could click a couple of times. So last week, for example, in Jeju, the IUCN released, no, it doesn't work. Thank you. This working paper attempting to set out what this means and what businesses in particular would need to do to be aligned with a nature positive goal and so on. So the really cool thing about this concept, the thing that's a bit different about it, even though it captures something everyone in this room understands well that we need to do, right? Obviously we need to go beyond slowing the damage we're doing and actually transform our society and our economy from one that's based on extraction and destruction to one that's based on restoration and regeneration. That's great. We all know that. The interesting thing is that this term is catching on. You know, companies are signing up to this, putting out pledges. Last week, I was in a conference of the Infrastructure Association of Queensland, and I asked the same question of them, how many people have heard of it? 20% of the room had heard of it. This is a group of, I don't know, engineers. I didn't stick around to talk to many of them. I assume many of them were engineers. So not the standard people who you know, we talk amongst ourselves. So this is getting some traction, and I think that's really cool. But next slide. We obviously need to you know, embrace a great positive global vision. But there are always risks when a new thing comes up, especially if it sounds pretty sexy like nature positive, right? There's always a risk of misdirection and greenwash. There may be actors out there wanting to use the term and to claim that they're doing it because they're covering up the fact that they're not very good at the basics. We have to get the foundations right. Next slide. So what are the foundations? I'm talking about the mitigation hierarchy. It's not sexy, it's old, it's something that we know we need to try to do. The idea of the mitigation hierarchy, for those not particularly familiar with it, is that, well, first of all, we recognise that we're actually not very good at restoring and repairing nature. There is a lot of nature that we can do a lot of good for through restoration, but I would say perhaps most of it we actually can't replace. And we're still damaging it. So the mitigation hierarchy essentially recognises this and says that first and foremost we must avoid impacts. We've been hearing about this all morning. And only after avoiding and minimising those impacts, if there is still an unavoidable residual impact on biodiversity, on nature, then we might need to do something to counterbalance that, to offset it. So only after achieving all of those things, I would suggest, could an organisation claim to be doing something aligned with nature positive if they then do something positive on top of that. So nature positive has got to be an and, not an alternative, not a way out of not implementing the mitigation hierarchy. Now that's fine. Obviously we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to be doing both the positive actions of voluntary investment in biodiversity recovery, as well as getting the basics right and stopping the current cycle of damage and destruction of irreplaceable nature that, particularly in Australia, that we're mired in right now. But we have to keep an eye on this interaction. So next slide. So I thought I'd talk about this interaction using an example, which is, you know, imminently going to come up on the slides, I'm sure. Sorry. Thank you. And something that was conveniently announced just a couple of months ago, Australia's proposed new biodiversity market. So this was, you know, a joint media release by the PM and the Environment Minister proposing that we would have a market to really enable us to move from the, you know, the parlous state of affairs set out in the State of the Environment report to have a platform that really makes it easy for not just governments, perhaps not governments at all, but certainly private industry to invest in doing good stuff for the environment, which sounds awesome. Of course, there's not very much that we know about it. Some of the things that we understand is that the aim is to facilitate this positive uplift in the state of our environment, and that the things that will be traded on this market are these certificates. It's a bit of a nebulous concept, presumably still being worked out, but they will be sort of one certificate per project. The project will have been some set of actions that are meant to achieve some good outcome, presumably, sort of like the carbon market works at the moment, and in fact governed in the same way the carbon market is governed, for better or for worse. And that these projects, these certificates are sort of at the project level, which makes it a bit hard to understand exactly how we're going to know from them which types, which biota, which bits of biodiversity have been benefited and how much they've been benefited. The understanding is that there is no planned public investment into this market, that this is a build it and they will come situation. Private investment only, which raises the question, so where will this money come from? What is the driver here? Now, obviously, the fact that organisations are signing on to these pledges for nature positive, that's going to be part of it. There's any number of initiatives, science-based targets for nature, task force for nature-related financial disclosures, all sorts of initiatives going on to encourage that voluntary disclosure and, ideally, investment in a nature positive future. Where is the real money right now? Next slide. So the major source of demand for investment in restoration, recovery at the moment is actually biodiversity offsets, that last step in the mitigation hierarchy. And it's those seeking offsets are actually finding supply really hard to come by. So I know landholders who've been approached by multiple potential buyers of offsets wanting to purchase the good things that those landholders are doing on their properties. And if you look at the example of the Queensland and New South Wales, both of which have essentially state-run funds into which developers can pay, and the offset obligation then passes to those funds. Those funds are now awash with millions of dollars, $90 million plus in New South Wales, $50 million plus in Queensland, and 90% of that money, they've not found the supply. That liability is sitting there. That's an accumulated loss that hasn't been able to be purchased. So, okay, so clearly we have a problem of supply. You know, maybe the market will help. Okay, next slide. I'll remember what's on it. However, you know, the information that did come out about the biodiversity market is that it's not intended as a way to create that supply. It's not intended as a market for these compliance offsets that are required of proponents or of the funds that have taken on that liability. And I think there's probably organisations in this room who put in submissions warning against allowing those compliance offsets to be part of this market. I want to talk about some of the reasons why that's really an important thing and something that we should stand by. But the interesting thing about this, the idea of keeping compliance offsets separate from this biodiversity market is it's just an illustration of a broader issue that affects any of us involved in charities, who do volunteer work, who work with community groups. Anybody who puts their labour in towards trying to achieve an environmental benefit, because the bottom line is that if you're providing an offset that's a compliance offset that's required by law, you're not actually achieving a net environmental benefit that wouldn't otherwise have happened. And that's the really key point. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So just as a quick refresher, thanks for working through my little animations there. Remembering, of course, that offsets are just aiming to at least counterbalance the negative impacts on biodiversity. So we lose some regent honeyeater habitat, we need to achieve an uplift in the amount of regent honeyeater habitat relative to what would otherwise have been there. It needs to be the same type, it needs to be the same amount, and it needs to persist for the same duration. Now, we're not really doing this very well, but this is what we're meant to be achieving. So let's just work on the idea that this is what offsets are doing. So this is the best case scenario, I guess. And there are really important reasons why all of these rules exist, and especially in Australia, because we call them biodiversity offsetting schemes, but they're not really. They're offsetting schemes just for particular elements of biodiversity that we've made a decision have gone and been depleted below a critical threshold. And so now they're endangered or vulnerable. They're threatened. So we actually really only offset stuff that we as a society recognise we've gone too far. We can't have any more net losses of that thing. So you can't really soften this up, right? You can't really do out-of-kind trades or say, well, maybe you don't need to do quite as much, or maybe you can just do a temporary offset. That's reasonable. Because every one of those weakening of these rules means that you are accumulating net losses for an already threatened species or ecosystem. Okay, next. So because of their design, obviously offsets are a zero-sum game. Like, they're meant to just achieve at least no net loss, but they're not as engaging with them is a zero-sum game in more than one way. So for those of us who want to do something voluntarily good for the environment, if we provide one of these offsets, if we create an environmental benefit, so, you know, I'm planting trees on our little block out west of here. If somebody comes along and says, well, will I need to buy that benefit to offset this impact? It's part of my conditions of approval. If I sell it, no longer can I wander around feeling good about the good thing I've done, because it's not mine anymore, it's theirs. They get to skite about it, not me. And that's the same for our organisations. If we are environmental organisations creating, you know, generating restoration, and we want to write about it in our annual reports, if you've sold it to someone else, you can't, because if everybody is claiming the same bit, then that's double counting, right? But worse, the benefit you've just created has been neutralised by definition. You've just sold it for an impact, for a loss. And if you hadn't done that, they would have had to generate that benefit somewhere else. So you've just undone the benefit that you've done. Now, that may be fine if that's what you're aiming to do, if you're fully informed about it and you're cool with that. But a lot of people may not be aware that that's what they're participating in. So this is where it gets really tricky. Next slide. Sorry, I've changed my slides right before I came in, so I'm curious as to see what I was going to say next. Oh, I was going to say the thing I just said. So essentially, you, if you sell those benefits, you undo them. And so then this becomes really interesting for, you know, conservation not-for-profits or organisations who are trying to generate uplift over and above what otherwise would have happened. How do we engage? There's this money floating around. It's really tempting to take it, right? And to feel that we still did something good, because we don't see the other side of the equation. Whoa. But obviously that's perfectly legitimate if that's part of the business model and everyone involved understands. If we're not perhaps using volunteers or tax-exempt status to essentially provide these benefits at a lower rate, to a business who actually is obliged to purchase that benefit one way or another. Because generally we're not really set up to subsidise commercial industry. So, something to think about. Next. A few more prosaic points about combining the idea of offsets in a biodiversity market. So what we understand about how it's being thought about, it doesn't really chime that well with all those rules I was talking about. If we have more generic certificates, which is probably not a bad idea because it makes them a bit more accessible, a bit easier for people to you know, set up and register. But of course, then they miss all of that really careful accounting that we know is so crucial to make sure our losses and gains actually balance and tick all those boxes to make sure that we are actually exchanging losses and gains of the same thing. But then again, if you did set up the market to be really onerous like that, who's going to want to set up, you know, these certificates on their place? You know, already we're struggling to convince people with money on the table right now to do it. So it's a bit of a dilemma. Worse still, having these nice certificates out there might tempt governments who are sitting on pots of money that they're getting pressure to spend because they have the obligation to purchase those offset benefits. Might tempt them to say, well, maybe we reform our policy to allow a bit of flexibility here because we can just purchase these things. We don't want to go down that path. Okay, next. And also, we want this market to actually facilitate, you know, to be a really positive thing and attract that voluntary investment ultimately. That's what we want to see, right? If we're going to do that, it needs to not have a bad smell about it. But every news story about offsets is a bad news story because we're not very good at doing them yet. So it's going to undermine the purpose of the market. I think the next slide is probably the last one. Okay, solutions. So keep the compliance offsets out of a voluntary biodiversity market for all those reasons. What can we do instead? Well, we could be bundling or stapling the biodiversity certificates to high integrity carbon credits once we sort that mess out. And that's something that's proven. We know people will pay a premium for good quality carbon credits. Fine. But I don't think we're getting around the fact that this market, just like the carbon market, mind you, in Australia, it needs to be kicked off with public investment. We need about $2 billion a year in threatened species investment to turn around the declines that we're seeing. In this room, that sounds unimaginably high as an amount of money. In that room last week, in the infrastructure world, that's not that much. It's a quarter of a submarine. Let's stop telling ourselves it's all too much. We really do need better public investment in biodiversity conservation. Okay, thank you. Sorry for that.